You were pregnant and didn't tell me? The words left Ryosuke's mouth as a blade of ice, sharp and cold in the sterile silence of his penthouse. Below him, the neon glow of Tokyo bled into the night sky, a kingdom he commanded with an iron will forged in shadow and steel. He was the Oyabun of the Azumigumi, a man whose name was a whisper of fear in boardrooms and a death sentence in back alleys. His power was absolute, his control meticulous. Yet, the voice on the other end of the phone, not hers, never hers but her friend's, had just shattered that control into 1,000 pieces. 8 months. 8 months of a hollow ache in his chest where Noelle used to be. 8 months of phantom warmth in his bed and the ghost of her laughter in rooms that had become tombs. He had orchestrated their separation with the cold precision of a military campaign, pushing her away with calculated cruelty because the war with the Nishida clan was escalating. He had made her believe he was a monster, so she would run, so she would be safe from the shrapnel of his life. He had succeeded. She had left, taking the only part of him that was ever human. And now this. A child. His child. The world tilted on its axis, the sprawling city below blurring into a meaningless smear of light and color. The Azumigumi, the treaties, the enemies circling like sharks, it all evaporated, reduced to ash by a single, impossible revelation. The phone was still pressed to his ear, Chloe's voice a distant, accusatory buzz. He couldn't hear the words, only the seismic shift within his own soul. His son. He had a son. The thought was not a joy but an agony, a testament to his greatest failure. He had protected her from his enemies, but had failed to protect their future. He had cut out his own heart to keep it safe, not realizing it was already nurturing a new life. A life he had nearly abandoned. A life that was now the most vulnerable piece on a board filled with predators. Which hospital? His voice was gravel, a command that brooked no argument. He didn't wait for a full answer, catching only the name of the district before the line went dead. He moved with a speed that belied his calm exterior. The custom-tailored suit felt like a cage, the weight of his empire a crushing burden. Haruto, his loyal shadow and second-in-command, appeared at the doorway, his face an impassive mask that hid a razor-sharp mind. He had seen his master's composure crack only once before, the day Noelle had walked out. Now he saw it shatter. Ready the car. Clear a path to Setagaya General. No stops. No questions, Haruto bowed, the movement fluid and economical, and vanished. Ryosuke stood for a moment longer, his reflection a stranger in the floor-to-ceiling glass. The man staring back was a king of a violent, lonely world. But for the first time in 8 months, a purpose ignited in his eyes, fierce and terrifying. It was not the ambition of a crime lord, but the primal instinct of a father. He was going to get his family back. And heaven help anyone who stood in his way. The journey through Tokyo's glittering veins was a blur of motion and memory. The sterile luxury of the Bentley's interior felt suffocating, each polished surface reflecting a ghost of the past. He remembered Noelle's hand in his, her fingers tracing the intricate dragon tattoo that coiled up his forearm as he drove. He remembered the way she'd laugh, a sound like wind chimes that had cut through the grim silence of his life. She had been his sanctuary, a vibrant, warm presence in a world of cold transactions and brutal necessities. Their divorce had been a lie, a carefully constructed piece of theater for an audience of his enemies. He'd been cold, dismissive, unfaithful, or so he'd made it seem. Every venomous word he'd spoken to her had been a shard of glass in his own throat. When she finally left, her eyes shimmering with the betrayal he had meticulously crafted, a part of him had died. He had told himself it was necessary. Kazuo Nishida, his most bitter rival, was not a man of honor. He targeted families, savored the emotional wreckage. Ryosuke had built a fortress of ice around himself and pushed Noelle out, believing the cold would keep the wolves at bay. He had never imagined she carried their son within her. The thought was a relentless torment. While he was waging a war in the shadows, she had been alone, carrying his heir, facing the fear and uncertainty without him. The depth of his failure was a chasm opening beneath him. He had thought himself a protector, but he was just a fool who had abandoned his queen and his prince on the eve of the most important battle of their lives. His hands clenched on the steering wheel, the knuckles white. The city lights streaked past, painting fleeting patterns on his stony face. His heart was a war drum, pounding out a rhythm of regret, fear, and a burgeoning, ferocious resolve. He had made a grave error, one he would now spend the rest of his life rectifying. The hospital air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and quiet desperation, a stark contrast to the iron and incense of his world. Ryosuke moved through the hushed corridors like a predator, his presence a ripple of unease in the placid environment. Nurses and doctors instinctively gave him a wide berth, sensing the coiled power beneath the expensive fabric of his suit. He found a room on the maternity ward, but a guardian stood at the door.
Chloe.
Noelle's best friend, her fiercely protective shield. Her eyes, usually so full of warmth, were chips of flint. "You have no right to be here," she hissed, her body blocking the doorway. She was small but immovable, a lioness defending her charge. Ryosuke's gaze was flat, devoid of the emotion churning within him. "Move," it was not a request. Chloe didn't flinch. "She doesn't want to see you. After what you did. You broke her. And now you show up here to what? Stake a claim? He's not a piece of property, Ryosuke. Neither is she." Every word was a justified blow, a truth he couldn't deny. He had broken her. He had done it on purpose, and the cost was a bill now coming due. But debating his sins was a luxury he didn't have time for. "I am not leaving," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "You can stand there all night, or you can let me see my son." The word son hung in the air between them, heavy and irrefutable. Chloe's resolve wavered, her anger warring with the exhaustion on her face. From inside the room, a soft cry echoed, the thin, reedy wail of a newborn. The sound struck Ryosuke with the force of a physical blow, bypassing all his defenses and lodging deep in his chest. It was the most powerful sound he had ever heard.
It was the sound of his bloodline.
It was the sound of his future. Chloe's shoulders slumped in defeat. She cast one last venomous glare at him before stepping aside. "Don't you dare hurt her again." Ryosuke walked past her without a word, his entire being focused on the room beyond. And then he saw her.
Noelle.
She was pale, propped up against the pillows, but her eyes were fixed on him, wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and a deep, weary sorrow that twisted his insides into knots. In her arms, wrapped in a blue blanket, was a tiny, perfect life. He stopped just inside the door, the world narrowing to the woman in the bed and the child she held. The air crackled with 8 months of unspoken pain, of lies and misunderstandings. Noelle watched him, her expression guarded, her arms tightening instinctively around the precious bundle. The baby fussed, a small fist waving in the air. Ryosuke's gaze dropped to the infant, and the breath left his lungs. He had faced down assassins, negotiated with monsters, and held the lives of hundreds in his hands, but nothing had prepared him for this. For the sight of his own son. He had his father's dark hair, a thick tuft that stood up defiantly. His skin was a beautiful blend of Noelle's rich brown and his own lighter tone. He was a perfect, impossible fusion of their two worlds. A profound, aching tenderness washed over Ryosuke, so potent it threatened to bring him to his knees. This was his legacy. Not the power, not the fear he inspired, but this tiny, vulnerable human. He took a hesitant step forward, his movements stripped of their usual confident authority. He felt like an intruder, a shadow darkening this sacred space. "Noelle," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. She didn't answer immediately, her eyes searching his for the man she had loved, not the cold stranger who had sent her away. "Why are you here, Ryosuke?" she finally asked, her voice fragile but steady. It was the question he deserved. "Chloe called me. She shouldn't have. She was right to," he countered softly. He took another step, his eyes never leaving the baby. "What is his name?" Noelle hesitated, a flicker of defiance in her gaze. "Kenshin, a strong name. A warrior's heart. It was perfect. Kenshin," Ryosuke repeated, the name a prayer on his lips. He was beside the bed now, close enough to see the delicate pulse beating at his son's temple. Why didn't you tell me? The question was not an accusation, but a plea. He needed to understand. Noel's gaze hardened slightly. And what would you have done? Sent a check? Claimed him as another asset? I didn't want him raised in your world, Ryosuke. I wanted him to be safe. I wanted him to have a chance at a life that didn't involve all of this. She gestured vaguely, a sweeping motion that encompassed the violence, the fear, the gilded cage she had escaped. He couldn't argue with her logic. He had made his world a place unfit for a child, unfit for her. He had done it himself. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a low, insistent buzz. He ignored it, his focus entirely on Noel and Kenshin. But it buzzed again, then a third time. It was Haruto's emergency signal. A cold dread, separate from the emotional turmoil of the room, began to seep into his veins. With a final, apologetic glance at Noel, he pulled the phone out. The text was short, coded, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. Nishida knows.
En route, Kazuo.
The blood in Ryosuke's veins turned to ice. His war with the Nishida clan had not ended. It had merely entered a quiet phase. He had dismantled much of Kazuo's operation, forcing the man into hiding. But Kazuo was a cornered rat, and cornered rats were the most dangerous. Somehow, he had learned about Noel's presence at the hospital.
He knew about the baby.
He knew Ryosuke's greatest weakness had just been born. The hospital, a place of healing and new life, had instantly transformed into a hunting ground. Ryosuke's entire demeanor shifted. The remorseful ex-husband vanished, replaced by the oyabun. His eyes became hard, his posture rigid. He was a general assessing a battlefield. Noel saw the change immediately, a familiar fear dawning in her eyes. What is it? What's wrong? He didn't answer, already moving. He strode to the window, peering down at the street below. He saw it instantly. A black sedan, out of place, parked across the street. Two men inside, their faces obscured by shadow, but their intent was as clear as the glint of city light on their car. They weren't waiting. They were watching. We have to go. Now, he said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. He turned back to her, his gaze intense. Noel, you have to trust me, Chloe, who had been lingering by the door, stepped forward. Trust you? You're the reason she's in danger, aren't you? It was a direct hit, but he didn't have time to bleed. Yes, he admitted without hesitation. I am. Which also makes me the only one who can get her and my son out of here alive. He was already on the phone with Haruto, issuing a stream of clipped, precise commands. Lock down the floor. West stairwell. I need an extraction team at the service exit in 5 minutes.
No sirens.
Sterile corridor. Go, he hung up and looked at Noel, who was clutching Kenshin to her chest, her face a mask of terror. He had wanted to shield her from this world, and instead, he had led it right to her doorstep. The ultimate failure. Noel, he said, his voice softening just a fraction, an appeal across the chasm he had created between them. I will not let anything happen to you or to him. I swear on my life. The quiet hum of the hospital was shattered by the distant sound of a commotion, a muffled shout from down the hall. Time was up. Kazuo's men were moving. Ryosuke's training, his entire life's brutal conditioning, took over. He stripped off his suit jacket, tossing it onto a chair. He was all lean muscle and deadly purpose. Chloe, get the baby's bag. Anything essential. Now, he commanded. To his surprise, she didn't argue, her fear overriding her animosity. She scrambled to gather the few belongings. Ryosuke turned to Noel, his hands gentle but firm as he helped her sit up. She winced, the pain of childbirth still fresh. I can't move fast, she whispered, her voice trembling. You won't have to, he assured her. He carefully took Kenshin from her arms. The weight of his son, so small and fragile, was a stark contrast to the cold steel he was used to holding. For a fleeting second, his heart seized with a love so fierce it was painful. He wrapped the blanket tighter around the baby and settled him securely in the crook of one arm. Then, Without a word of warning, he scooped Noelle up into his other arm. She gasped, her hands flying to his shoulders. "Ryosuke." "Hold on tight," he murmured, his face grim. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his chest. He kicked the door open and moved into the hallway. Two of his men, Haruto's best, were already there, guns drawn, their dark suits a funereal presence against the pale green walls. They flanked him, moving in a seamless, practiced formation. The hallway was a scene of chaos. A nurse lay on the floor, groaning, and a cart was overturned, its contents scattered. At the far end, two of Kazuo's thugs were trying to get past another of his men. The pop of a silenced pistol was a dull cough in the sterilized air. One of the thugs went down. The other raised his weapon. Ryosuke didn't hesitate. He shifted Noelle's weight, freeing his right hand just enough. He never carried a weapon himself, his men were his weapons. But his body was one. He grabbed a metal clipboard from a wall mount and flung it with vicious accuracy. It spun through the air like a discus, catching the remaining gunman square in the face with a sickening crunch. The man staggered back, and Ryosuke's guard finished the job with another silent shot. Noelle buried her face in his shoulder, shielding her eyes from the violence she had always feared. Kenshin, remarkably, slept through it all, safe in the fortress of his father's arms. They reached the west stairwell, the emergency exit door held open by Haruto himself. "Clear to the service exit," Haruto reported, his eyes sweeping the corridor for any further threats. "Car is waiting," Ryosuke nodded, his breathing even despite carrying the weight of his entire world. He descended the concrete stairs, his steps sure and steady, a stark contrast to the trembling of the woman in his arms. He had failed to keep the violence away from her, but he would be damned if he failed to protect her from it. The ride to the safe house was a silent, tension-filled ordeal. The armored SUV sliced through the night, a black phantom invisible to the city's ordinary inhabitants. In the back, Noelle sat huddled in the corner, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, Kenshin sleeping peacefully in a carrier buckled beside her. Ryosuke sat opposite, not daring to get too close, giving her the space she so clearly needed. He watched her, cataloging the exhaustion etched onto her beautiful features, the fear that still lingered in her eyes. The violence at the hospital had been a brutal confirmation of everything she had run from. He had shown her his monster, the very thing he had tried to hide. He saw her glance at him, her gaze unreadable, before quickly looking away. The silence between them was a heavy shroud, filled with the ghosts of their shared past and the terrifying uncertainty of their future. Haruto, in the front passenger seat, finally broke the quiet. "The hospital is secure. We have the men who survived. They will talk." His voice was flat, a simple statement of fact. In their world, talk was a euphemism for a process that ended in only one way. Ryosuke merely nodded, his eyes still fixed on Noelle. This wasn't over. Kazuo was still out there. A threat that had been professional had now become deeply personal. An attack on the Izumigumi was one thing. An attack on his son was a declaration of war with no rules and no quarter. The safe house was a modern, anonymous building in a quiet residential district, its unassuming facade hiding a fortress of reinforced steel and bulletproof glass. As they were ushered inside, the sterile luxury felt cold and impersonal. It was a cage, however gilded. Chloe had been sent ahead in a separate car and was waiting, her face pale. She immediately went to Noelle, helping her settle onto a plush sofa, fussing over Kenshin. Ryosuke stood apart, feeling like a storm cloud that had followed them indoors. He gave Haruto quiet instructions to double the perimeter and get a doctor to check on Noelle and the baby. When he was finally alone with them, the weight of the night pressed down on him. He had saved them, but he had also damned them. He had brought them back into the heart of the danger. He waited until Chloe had taken Kenshin to a prepared nursery to sleep. He and Noelle were finally, truly alone. The air was thick with unspoken words, a dam of pain and misunderstanding ready to burst. He sat in an armchair across from her, the distance feeling like a mile. "Noelle," he began, his voice low and strained. "We need to talk." She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. There's nothing to talk about. You made your choice 8 months ago, Ryosuke. You chose your life, your power over me. That's not true, he said, the denial raw and immediate. Every cold word, every fabricated argument. It was all a lie, her expression hardened with disbelief. A lie? You told me I was a distraction. You told me you were tired of me. You broke my heart with a smile on your face. That didn't feel like a lie. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, forcing himself to meet her wounded gaze. It was a lie to save your life. Kazuo Nishida, the man whose men were at the hospital. His war with me was escalating. He doesn't fight with honor. He targets families.
Wives.
Children. I saw what he did to my predecessor's family. I couldn't. I would not let that be you. The confession spilled out of him, the ugly truth he had hidden for so long. I had to make you hate me. I had to make you leave, to go somewhere he could never find you. It was the only way I knew to keep you safe. Pushing you away was the hardest thing I've ever done. It killed me every single day you were gone. Noelle stared at him, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The anger in her eyes slowly gave way to a dawning, horrified understanding. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been protecting her. You could have told me, she whispered, her voice cracking. You could have trusted me. And asked you to live in a bunker? To look over your shoulder every second of every day? To live in constant fear? He countered, his own voice thick with anguish. I chose to bear that burden alone. I thought it was the honorable thing to do. But I was wrong. I was a proud fool. I should have told you. I should have trusted you. And now, because of my pride, I almost lost you both. The dam broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, then another. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a long-held pain finally being released. He had hurt her, yes, but not out of malice. Out of a desperate, misguided love. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were cold. He held them, trying to pour his own warmth, his own desperate regret, into her. When I heard about Kenshin, Noelle, my world stopped. All the power, the territory. It meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was you. And him. She looked down at their joined hands, at the stark contrast between her skin and his, at the dragon tattoo coiling around his wrist. The symbol of the life she had fled. He can't have this life, Ryosuke, she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. I won't let him grow up afraid. I won't let him become like you. Her words should have stung, but he heard no accusation in them, only a mother's fierce, protective plea. He won't, Ryosuke vowed, his grip tightening on her hands. I will end this. I will end it for good. He stood up, a new, unshakable resolve settling over him. For months, he had been fighting a strategic war against Kazuo, a game of attrition. No more. This was no longer about business or territory. This was about his son's future. He pulled out his phone and called Haruto. His loyal lieutenant answered on the first ring. Ryosuke's voice was devoid of all emotion, cold and absolute as a winter execution. Haruto. Find Kazuo Nishida. I don't want him brought in. I don't want a message sent. I want him erased. I want his entire organization turned to dust by sunrise. Use every resource. Burn it all to the ground. There can be no trace left. No one to seek revenge. No one to remember his name. Is that clear? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Haruto had never heard an order like this from him. It was not a strategic move. It was an annihilation. Crystal, Haruto replied, his own voice imbued with a new, grim purpose. The call ended. Ryosuke turned back to Noelle. In his eyes, she saw the terrifying power of the Oyabun, the man feared throughout Japan. But for the first time, she understood it. It was a power he was now wielding not for himself, but for them. It was the power to build a wall around his family that no one would ever breach again. He was making a choice. Not between his power and her, but to use his power to secure a future with her. 2 years later, the scent of salt and pine filled the air. The sprawling, modern house overlooked a quiet bay, far from the suffocating neon glow of Tokyo. The waves crashed against the shore in a gentle, rhythmic pattern, a peaceful heartbeat for their new life. Ryosuke stood on the veranda, watching his son, Kenshin, take wobbly steps across the manicured lawn. The little boy, now a sturdy toddler with his mother's bright eyes and his father's determined chin, chased after a butterfly, his delighted shrieks echoing in the calm afternoon. Noelle came to stand beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, the gesture easy and familiar. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, serene contentment. "He's getting so fast," she murmured, a smile in her voice. "He'll be running the estate by the time he's 5, Ryosuke replied, a rare, genuine smile touching his own lips. The man he was now was fundamentally different from the one who had ruled Tokyo's underworld. The Oyabun was a ghost, a role he had shed like a second skin. After that night, he had been true to his word. Kazuo Nishida and his entire syndicate had vanished from the face of the earth, a brutal, silent purge that had sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. With the threat eliminated, Ryosuke had done the unthinkable. He had stepped down. He officially named Haruto, his ever-loyal second, as his successor, retaining a controlling interest and advisory role but removing himself completely from the day-to-day violence and politics. He had traded his throne for this.
For peace. For them.
Kenshin stumbled and fell onto the soft grass, looking up at them with a surprised expression before bursting into a grin. Ryosuke's heart swelled. This was his empire now. This small patch of earth, this house, this woman, this boy. It was a kingdom of laughter and scraped knees, of bedtime stories and quiet mornings. It was infinitely more valuable than anything he had left behind. He had learned the hardest lesson of his life, that true power wasn't about control, but about protection. It wasn't about the strength to push people away, but the courage to hold them close. He leaned down and kissed Noelle, a slow, lingering kiss filled with the promises of 1,000 peaceful tomorrows. Their past was a scar, a reminder of the fire they had walked through. But they had survived. They had rebuilt. And in the warm afternoon sun, with the sound of their son's laughter as the anthem of their new life, they were finally, truly home.